Hey, it's Dr. Calatrello coming to you live from the Purple Parrot Lounge, where I spend most of my waking hours. Today we're going to talk a little bit about one of the key elements of fiction, which is called plot. And you'll find that in any introduction to literature class, or really any introduction level course, you will find as a student that you're introduced to a lot of different terms. And there's a reason for that. Every discipline, whether it's sociology, English, political science, chemistry, every discipline has a terminology that its practitioners use when they are discussing their discipline. So that's one of the things that you're going to be acquiring this semester. One of the objectives of the class is to give you the language, the vocabulary that we use when we are discussing literature. So the first thing that we're going to do today is talk a little bit about plot. Okay, so plot can be defined as the sequence of events in a story, the way it's composed, the way it's presented in a significant order. Plot then, simply put, is what happens in the story. For some reason, and I'm not quite sure why, students often will mistake or confuse plot with theme. Remember, plot is what happens in the story. Theme is what it means. On a related note, since plot is what happens in a story, we can't really argue or have a conversation about plot in its most basic terms, because it either happened in the story or it didn't happen in the story. And authors make decisions to reveal some things and not to reveal other things. So while we can't have a debate or an argument about whether or not something happened, because we have the text, correct, that we can go to and we can look at. Since we can either point to it and say, look, it happened here or it didn't happen here. One of the things we can have a conversation about is how effective a plot is, or how believable it is, or how plausible, how practical it is, and the decisions that the writer made in the construction of the plot. And so the first two stories that we're going to be reading in this little section on plot are chosen because of what they reveal to us as readers about decisions regarding storytelling, or a fancy term for discussing narratives is narratology. Okay, if you go to graduate school in English, you may take a class in narratology, which is about storytelling and the decisions that we make and how we put together stories and how we present the action to our readers. I do want to mention this idea. I don't believe your textbook addresses this, but I think it's an important thing to keep in mind, and that is that most plots reveal and often are developed by conflict, which can be thought of as a clash of actions, a clash of ideas. Narrative structures. Okay, so sophisticated readers, and of course we all are sophisticated readers, or are certainly on our way to becoming sophisticated readers, we pay attention to how a story is being told, and for the choices that the writer makes about how to present or how to unfold the story for the reader. And there are a number of ways that writers can choose to present the action and present the characters to their readers. And even more intriguing is what the effect of those choices has on the reader. In other words, what's the effect of being told a story in a certain way, having the action presented, delivered to us in different strategies, or using different strategies. One of the most basic types of narrative structures is the chronological approach, right? And the chronological order is a term that you probably are all pretty familiar with. A chronological approach is simply time sequence, right? First this happens, and then something else happens, a third event unfolds, a fourth, and so on. So a chronological approach is one of the most basic types of stories. A different approach, particularly in a short story, where the form itself is by definition shorter than, say, a novel, a writer might use a term called in medias res, which means a Latin phrase for in the middle of. And so with that approach, the writer, in effect, drops us right down in the middle of the action. And we are placed right. Something has obviously happened before that we may not know, but we're dropped down right in the middle of it, and this is where the action begins for us. But we have the understanding, right, because we're sophisticated, that something has happened before this story, before we come to the story, I should say. Okay. Another common strategy is the flashback, and we're all familiar with that term probably from our television watching, okay, or from our movie watching days, right? The strategy of the flashback is the device or the strategy that informs us about events that happened before the opening scene of a work, okay? So where the writer takes us back, flashes us back to some action that has happened before the action that we are experiencing before our eyes in the text of the story. I mentioned a moment ago that sometimes plot is driven or revealed by a conflict, a clash, right, of ideas, of actions, or of wills between or among characters. Right, and of course a character is an imagined person in the story. Generally speaking, when we talk about conflict, and this is important, one of the things that you want to keep an eye out when you're reading fiction is trying to identify the nature of the conflict that we are experiencing, that we're witnessing in the pages before us. There is what can be called the conflict of a person against a person. That's pretty straightforward, right? Two characters are going at it. There's a clash. There's something that's driving a wedge between two characters, revenge, jealousy, envy, love, and it's posed one character against another, okay? A second type of conflict is a person against his or her environment. And for me, that's one of the most exciting types of fiction to read about, when you have a character, a human being, who is in direct conflict with his or her immediate environment around them. Now, that can be a physical environment, right? Okay, it can be a landscape, and here we're talking about setting. So it can be a physical environment that the character is in conflict with. You got a character at sea, you have a character lost in a jungle, a spooky castle, okay, a physical environment. But one of the other things I want you to think about too is the idea that an environment can be more than the physical setting. It can be an environment that is an environment that has to do with values or ideas or prejudice or bigotry. That can be an environment where a character does not feel comfortable and finds himself or herself in conflict with the prevailing attitudes or the prevailing values of his immediate surroundings. Okay. The third kind of conflict is the kind of conflict where a person has some kind of moral struggle, some kind of internal dilemma, a moral dilemma that's going on within him or within herself. Okay. And one of the things I think that deserves mentioning here is that each type of conflict that you see on this slide is the kind of conflict that you yourself have experienced in your own life, or the kind of conflicts that you've seen around you. Okay, that's because good art or good fiction really does try to mirror life. Okay, and that's where, again, one of the distinctions between formulaic fiction and literary fiction come into play. Okay, the more literary the work is, chances are you're going to be able to identify with the types of conflict that you see the characters going through. Okay, at some point in the plot, the author's going to have to present his characters to us as readers. Okay, the central characters in a conflict, the central character in a story, whether that person is sympathetic or unsympathetic, those characters are referred to as protagonists. Okay, the protagonist is normally the main character in the story, and it's typically the one, as a reader, we are going to identify with. Okay, it's the character that we're going to be watching closely. Okay, the forces arrayed against that protagonist, whether persons, things, conventions of a society, or traits of their own character, are known as the antagonists. Okay, so protagonists are antagonized, right, by obstacles, whether it's another person who is introducing some conflict, or whether or not it's a prevailing value or idea of a society. These forces are referred to as the antagonistic forces, and the person who's experiencing them, that character, we call that character the protagonist. And again, this is terminology, but as somebody who's becoming a sophisticated reader, you want to be equipped with that vocabulary, so you know these terms. So when we say protagonist, or you hear the term antagonist, you know what that means. I alluded to this just ever so briefly a few minutes ago, but generally speaking, formulaic or commercial fiction, it will rely more heavily on physical conflict between individuals. Okay, so formulaic fiction, commercial fiction is going to have a lot of action. The plots are going to contain lots of physical action. In romance novels, there's probably going to be a lot of sex. In Western or detective fiction, you're going to have lots of physical fights, right? Think about television shows and movies too. Think about your particular genres, the real commercial ones that, like 24 with Jack Bauer, most of his conflicts are going to be physical ones. Lots of fights, lots of shooting, blowing up helicopters. And by contrast, usually literary fiction will rely more heavily on mental, moral, or emotional conflicts. Now, these are generalizations, I grant you that, but generally speaking, the more literary a piece of fiction is, when we look at the protagonist's conflict, what we're going to find is that conflict is generally something that is an internal, emotional, mental, moral sort of conflict. Now, certainly, as a writer begins his or her story, there's a certain amount of background information needs to be presented to the reader. So we have a context, right, against which we can view this action. This is typically referred to as exposition. Okay, it's that background information that the reader needs to make sense of things. A related kind of key idea is a term called chronotope, and you won't find this in your book, but chronotope I always thought was a really kind of cool concept I learned about. And chrono means time, and tope is a abbreviated version of topography, or think about landscaping, like a topographical map, right, where you see the lay of the land. So chronotope, that term, means time and place, and usually a writer within that exposition period of a piece of fiction will reveal certain details about the setting that are going to reveal chronotope. In other words, what kind of time are we living in and what kind of place is it? So that's just kind of a cool idea to keep in mind as you're reading through these stories. Look for those kind of details that reveal, are we in the time of horse and buggy, or is this set in the future somehow? And how do we know that? These are subtle things that writers think about. Rising action is certainly a part of particularly short fiction, and the rising action will generally come from some type of complication or the introduction of some kind of conflict. And again, we've talked about the different types of conflict. But this all leads up to this idea of suspense. And suspense is the quality in a story that makes readers ask, what's going to happen next? Or how will this turn out? And if a writer does not introduce skillfully at some point, and generally sooner than later, particularly in a short story, some kind of element of suspense, then the risk of not doing that is that the reader quits reading. Okay, so something has to be introduced in the plot of a story to make us want to keep reading. That thing, right, that element is called suspense. Now, in commercial or formulaic fiction, as we've been talking about, suspense is usually enhanced by, as readers, identifying with sympathetic characters, right? We're somehow sympathetic, we empathize, we identify with the hero or the heroine, and so we want to know, right, what's going to happen? How is this going to turn out? Will the hero win? Will he prevail? Or we'll find out actually who, in the detective mystery, the whodunit, that will be revealed to us. Or in a romantic, formulaic kind of story, we want to know, will the boy get the girl, right? When we watch a Tom Hanks or a Meg Ryan movie, we're just wondering, oh gosh, will Meg finally find love this time? Now, of course, we know she will, because that's what we paid our money for, right? We wanted that kind of happily ever after ending to our story. Okay? So if we were going to chart a plot, right, we would have exposition, we would have some rising action, we would have conflict, we would have suspense. At some point, there would be a climax to the story, right? Where the greatest amount of emotional tension is released. Afterwards, we would have a period known as the resolution, or the French word denouement, right, which means the untying of the knot. And so the denouement, or the resolution at the end, is that is the ending of that story. After the big kind of emotional action has been revealed, when the conflict has been resolved, or in a more literary story, maybe it hasn't been resolved, and we have a more open ending to the story. We have to have, though, some kind of closing to the story, and that is known as the resolution. Two ways to create suspense are to introduce some element of mystery or some kind of unusual set of circumstances for which we crave some type of explanation. Think about William Faulkner's story, A Rose for Emily, a great example of that. Or another thing the writer can do is put the protagonist in a dilemma, a position in which he or she must choose between two courses of action, both undesirable. So yeah, anytime you can put the protagonist, and again, that's the character that we're identifying with, anytime the writer can put that protagonist in a dilemma where he or she has to choose one course of action, and neither of those actions are desirable, that's going to be interesting, right? That's going to create suspense because we've identified with the character and we want to know what's going to happen. How's this going to turn out? Will the protagonist be triumphant, or will the character be defeated? Okay, well, we'll come to a close with just one final idea about plot. It has to do with the endings of of stories. Closely connected with suspense is this idea of surprise at the end of a story. Now, a surprise ending at the end of a story is used more often in formulaic fiction or escape type literature. Because less experienced readers often demand or they expect some kind of surprise ending, right? They want to see all of the various conflicts resolved in a nice, neat, and orderly fashion. So the surprise ending might involve some really improbable plot twist at the end, like a long-lost relative shows up. Think about the end of the movie It's a Wonderful Life, right? When the protagonist is in financial ruin or is in desperate straits, and then all of a sudden the long-lost relative shows up and with inheritance money. So by contrast, though, literary fiction does not usually have a surprise ending. Sometimes it can leave us with a more open-ended sort of ending, which is the kind that I kind of like because it allows for any number of possibilities. Now, a surprise ending, if a surprise ending seems logical and natural as we look back over the story, as we think about the plot and what's happened and how it's presented, we can say that the surprise ending is fairly achieved and that it makes sense, or that it's plausible, or that it's a well-constructed plot. And here I would point you to Edith Wharton's story, Roman Fever, which has such an amazing ending to it. I'm not going to ruin it for you, but it's the kind of ending when you get to it, it's a surprise. But when you go back and you think about that plot and you read through the story again, you see that the ending that Wharton gives us is one that is logical. It's one that does make sense. It is one that's natural, but it's not one that we see coming. And neither does Grace. I'm sorry, Alida. So I've gone over my time, and for that I apologize, but I hope you found some of the ideas in the little presentation here helpful or useful as you take on the stories. Again, if you have questions, let me know. If you want me to talk about something else or explain something differently or give another example, just post it on the message board and I'd be glad to do so.